The historical smokescreen. When you hear the phrase, greatest explorers in history, your brain immediately conjures up Christopher Columbus staring dramatically at the horizon. Ferdinand Magellan looking heroic while his crew mutinied behind his back. Or Vasco da Gama, acting like he discovered something nobody had ever seen before. Movies, textbooks, and a healthy dose of European exceptionalism have drilled into our heads a very specific picture. That exploration began when Europeans decided to get on boats and go somewhere. End of story. Case closed. But hidden beneath that historical propaganda, there's a far more fascinating tale. A story about explorers who roamed the known world, hundreds of years before Columbus was even a twinkle in Genoa's eye. They didn't have GPS. They didn't have satellite imagery. They didn't even have decent maps half the time. And yet they traveled farther than most Europeans could ever dream of. So who were these legendary figures? Where did they go? And why the heck hasn't anyone told you about them? Today, we're going to rip that curtain down. We're going to meet two of the greatest adventure explorers who ever lived. One came from the scorching deserts of Morocco, the other from the mighty empire of China. Two men, two fates, two completely different paths. But both did things that the world had never seen before. And the story begins with one absolutely mind-blowing truth. Columbus wasn't the first. He wasn't even close. Ibn Battuta, the man who walked further than anyone before him. Let's start with a name you've probably never heard in your life. Ibn Battuta. And no, that's not a new flavor of hummus. He was born in Tangier, Morocco, on February 24, 1304. Tangier was a pretty chill place back then, unless you count the occasional crusader raid. But young Ibn had bigger plans than hanging around the Moroccan coast. At the ripe old age of 21, he decided to leave home. His mission? The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. A perfectly normal thing for a young Muslim man to do. The journey should have taken him about 2 years. It took him 30. Yes, 30 years. Because Ibn Battuta had one minor problem. He couldn't stop traveling. When he finally returned home after 3 decades, he had covered over 120,000 kilometers. That's about 75,000 miles for my American friends. To put that in perspective, the Earth's circumference is about 40,000 kilometers. This man walked nearly 3 times around the planet. All of this was done on foot, on camels, and on whatever rickety ships he could find. No airplanes, no cruise ships, no Google Maps telling him where the nearest Starbucks was. Just sandals, determination, and probably a lot of blisters. Ibn Battuta is the only known medieval traveler who visited the lands of every Muslim ruler of his era. That's a flex if I've ever heard one. He traveled through North Africa, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and reached Mecca. He visited Iraq, Persia, and then went back to Mecca again. Because apparently once wasn't enough. Then he sailed down the east coast of Africa, all the way to Kilwa in modern-day Tanzania. He described Kilwa as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world, which is high praise coming from a guy who had seen basically everywhere. From there, he went to Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, and back to Mecca for the 3rd time. 3rd time's the charm, he probably said. But Battuta wasn't done. Oh no. This guy had no off switch. He went to India and became an advisor to the Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. And here's where things get really interesting. The Sultan, who was apparently a bit of a lunatic, appointed Battuta as an ambassador to China. On the way there, he stopped by the Maldives, where he married into the royal family and became the chief judge. Because why not? He had some spare time. He visited Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, Bengal, Sumatra, and eventually made it to China. He was one of the first Western writers to describe the Great Wall. Imagine that. A Moroccan guy writing about the Chinese wall. That's cultural exchange at its finest. And then, after all that, he went home. But not to retire. Oh no. He continued his journey to Islamic Spain and crossed the Sahara Desert to Timbuktu and Gao in Mali. Because apparently, he hadn't suffered enough heat stroke already. In total, Ibn Battuta visited over 40 modern-day countries, and he documented every single one in his book, The Rihla. It's one of the greatest travelogues ever written. And if you haven't read it, you're missing out. So why haven't most people heard of him? Is it because he wasn't European? Is it because he didn't discover anything new? Or is it because Western historians conveniently forgot about him? Probably a mix of all three. But here's the kicker. When Columbus was still a toddler, Ibn Battuta had already walked across 3 continents and nearly half the world. Let that sink in. Zheng, the admiral of the giant ships. Now let's hop over to a completely different story, one that involves ships bigger than anything Europe had ever seen. In 1405, the Chinese Emperor Yongle gave an order. Build me a fleet. Not just any fleet, the treasure fleet. And who did he put in charge? A guy named Zheng. But not your average admiral. Zheng was a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan. Yes, you heard that correctly. A Muslim eunuch became the greatest admiral in Chinese history. History is weird, folks. Unlike Ibn Battuta, who was a solo wanderer, Zheng He commanded a massive naval armada. Over 300 ships. Over 27,000 crew members. I repeat, 27,000 people. And the treasure ships themselves were absolutely insane. Chinese records describe them as 137 meters long and 55 meters wide. That's about 450 feet long. For comparison, the largest European ships of the 16th century were only about half that size. These massive vessels had 9 masts, 4 decks, and could carry over 500 passengers. They were equipped with 24 bronze cannons. They had watertight compartments, a design so advanced that Europe wouldn't figure it out for centuries. They were basically floating cities. Zheng He's fleet made 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433. He sailed through Southeast Asia, India, and all the way to the eastern coast of Africa. He defeated pirates in Palembang, conquered the Kotte Kingdom in Sri Lanka, and put down rebellious forces in Sumatra. But here's what makes Zheng He different from European explorers. He wasn't a conqueror, he was a diplomat. His job was to establish trade relations, spread Chinese influence, and bring back cool stuff for the emperor. His ships were loaded with silk, porcelain, gold, and bronze. When the fleet arrived at ports, ambassadors from all over the world boarded. They came to pay tribute and establish diplomatic relations. The treasure fleet brought dozens of countries into China's tributary system. It was an unprecedented display of power and wealth. And it all happened more than half a century before Columbus sailed west. So why didn't we learn about Zheng He in school? Well, after he died, China turned inward. Confucian scholars burned the records of the fleet. Shipyards were shut down. And the knowledge of how to build those massive ships was lost. A civilization that once ruled the seas chose to isolate itself. And that's one of history's great tragedies. But let's not get too sad, because Zheng He's legacy is still incredible. He proved that China could have dominated global trade. He showed that the oceans were highways, not barriers. And he did it all without colonizing or enslaving anyone. Imagine that. What did they achieve that Columbus didn't? Let's take a moment to compare, just for fun. Columbus had 3 ships. Zheng He had over 300 ships. Columbus had about 90 crew members. Zheng He had 27,000 people. Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic. Zheng He sailed south and west across the Indian Ocean. But they shared one thing in common. Both were looking for a route to wealthy lands. However, Zheng He wasn't looking for a new world. He already knew the world was huge. He was simply connecting what already existed. And Ibn Battuta? He didn't sail across vast oceans. He walked, rode camels, and sailed along coastlines. But he traveled further than almost anyone in history. He experienced more cultures than anyone in his era. And he did it all without a single gun or cannon. These 2 men were pioneers. They showed that oceans were not barriers. They were connections. Columbus deserves his place in history. But Columbus stood on the shoulders of giants. And those giants came from Morocco and China. Let's also talk about the ethics here. Columbus's voyages led to colonization, slavery, and genocide. Zheng He's voyages led to diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. Ibn Battuta's travels led to understanding, documentation, and knowledge. See the difference? It's not just about who went further. It's about what they did when they got there. And by that measure, the pre-Columbus explorers were far more impressive. Conclusion: the forgotten roads. So after all of this, what have we learned? We've learned that the history of exploration doesn't begin with Columbus. It began way earlier, and it began in many more places than we think. Ibn Battuta walked over 120,000 kilometers in 30 years. Zheng He commanded the largest fleet the world had ever seen. Both were pioneers. Both pushed the limits of their times. And both were conveniently forgotten by Western history. Why? Maybe because history is written by the victors. And the victors of the age of exploration were Europeans. But here's the truth. Before Columbus, there was Ibn Battuta. Before Magellan, there was Zheng He. They didn't discover new lands. They connected with civilizations that already existed. They built bridges instead of empires. They traded instead of conquered. And in doing so, they created far more meaningful encounters than anything Columbus ever did. So the next time you think about great explorers, remember the Moroccan man who walked from Africa to China, and remember the Chinese admiral who sailed his giant fleet to African shores. They are the real explorers, not invaders, but connectors of worlds. Thank you for joining us on this journey through forgotten history. If this story changed the way you see exploration, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again as we uncover another forgotten chapter of human history. See you next time on the next grand historical journey.